Welcome everyone, and I am going to turn over to Lee to introduce herself and our topic today.
Thank you, Phil. Good morning, everybody. I'm really excited about this opportunity this morning. My name is Lee Hamri, and I'm a self-proclaimed URA relocation zealot. I've been known to sleep with the regulations and now HUD Handbook 1378 under my pillow. And so I'm really glad that I have fellow zealots joining us today. I own a company called HC Peck & Associates. I've been doing relocation work since 1991, and it's always a new adventure every day. And the idea around this presentation was to kind of discuss things that seem to be intuitive in these processes, and what terrible trouble being intuitive can cause us in some areas around our HUD funding and compliance. So what I'd like to do now is to tell you who my partners in crime here. That's not really true. My partners here are from my office. Magali Fernandez is a vice president, and she's been doing relocation for over 10 years, and she specializes in HUD projects and has been doing a lot of RAD work and a lot of temporary relocation stuff. And so she's going to chime in from a foot soldier, if you don't mind me saying so, Magali, and on the ground perspective. And we're really, really fortunate to have Jade Santoro of HUD region. Well, a lot of the regions, right? You're
Eight at the moment, fortunately.
At the moment, you're more than just one region. She's here in Denver. We're lucky to have her, and she and I have been working on a lot of things together. And it's in that work where I call Jade and say, "Can we really do this?" And she says, "Well, no, you can't, but this is what you can do." And so a lot of the work that we've done together has brought up many of these things that that if people are forewarned, they're forearmed about them. And so that was the exciting part of this for me, putting this together. And with COVID and the age of everything else, it's been sort of an interesting process. But Jade has been able to make some remarks, and if there's something in there that is not quite accurate from her perspective, she is going to absolutely let us know. So by the end of today, we'll have a really good presentation for you. So Jade's been doing this work since the home project started, so we're not going to age ourselves by giving dates, but I met
the home program, not just the home project, the home program.
The home program, absolutely. And so I've had the great benefit of working with Jade for many, many years, and I couldn't be happier that she's able to join us. She's in the middle of a HUD exercise, but she's using her lunch hour to do this with us. So we'll go ahead and move on. I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to get started with our presentation.
Lee, if you could get just a tad closer to your microphone, if there's any way to do that.
Yeah, is that better?
That is better, thank you.
Okay, yeah, perfect. And then my video will be gone here when I start sharing. Okay. Here we go. All right, yeah, so our title today is 50 Ways to Not Lose Your Money. My company is HC Peck & Associates. We've been in business since 1988, and we love to do this kind of work. So here we go. 50 ways not to lose your money, how to understand and follow HUD relocation. Move my thing here, rules. All right, I want to note that these slides are very dense. They're dense. I know that's not a good thing for most PowerPoint presentations, but in this case, hopefully you'll be able to use this PowerPoint as a guide when we're done with this. Since you're not going to get another handout, this will help you remind yourself about what we talked about. So the overview, we're going to go over the rules first. And the rules are, what are HUD relocation requirements and what triggers them? What are the specific program rules under URA regulation, NOFA, etc.? What is the URA? What is Section 104D? What is Section 18? How do you know what applies? Who is eligible for benefits? What are those benefits? How do I figure out the timing what's the process, and what should I definitely not do to keep myself out of trouble. Second part is the 50 ways. I'm going to give you a little hint. We do not have time today to go over all the rules and all the 50 ways. So we're going to be asking you guys to help us a little bit later on, but we've got lots of ways to discuss. So here come the rules. If you can see over here, I have got the, this is the most recent promulgating regulation for the Uniform Act. You'll notice that some of the numbers in there, it has not been updated to show changes that were done as part of MAP 21. So my understanding is that the feds are working very hard on getting a new set of regulations out. There's been a notice of proposed rulemaking, and then they're working. So we're hoping for new regulations soon, and then that will change a few things, but we're working with what we got. So here we go with the rules. When is your project subject to HUD relocation requirements? Okay, well, there are certain HUD programs that actually mandate relocation, and these three up here have their own program rules: HUD Section 104D, HUD Section 18, and HUD RAD programs. Do remember that the overarching across the board law and regulation is called the Uniform Relocation Assistance and Real Property Acquisition Policies Act of 1970 as amended, or the URA, or the Act, or whatever, and those promulgating regulations, and they apply across the board in most situations. Some they don't, and we'll talk about that too. But we need to have a good understanding of the URA and these programs to understand what rules apply and what we need to do.
Lee, can I jump in for half a second? I just want to say that Section 104D isn't actually a program. It's a rule that applies to CDBG and home. Section 18 is a public housing demolition disposition program. And Section 18 is actually the rule that exempts that demo dispo program from the URA, and HUD RAD is its own special animal. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
That's great. And we'll get into more of these. We'll get a little bit more information later as we go. Thank you, Jade. That's great. The URA, just the facts. It does cover any federal or federally assisted project which involves real property acquisition, rehabilitation, or demolition. There are at least 19 federal agencies, including the Department of Transportation, GSA, HUD, Department of Defense, Department of Agriculture. Everybody uses it. It's been used nationwide. We're almost at the 50-year mark, I think, Jade. I think it's 1971, which is, holy mackerel, going to be 50 years, I think, in January. We'll have the 50-year birthday. It sets minimum assistance standards and maximum payments, and it does provide guidance that can and should be applied uniformly and equitably. It doesn't make people whole, and while some people may not think it's fair, it must be applied fairly and equitably. So we'll go into a little bit more about that. I like to think about the Uniform Act protections and how it works, how it all works together, is that you have a three-legged stool, and without one of these legs, the stool would fall over. So I believe that this law and the regulations were promulgated to protect the project and the project owner, to protect the property owner and the displaced persons, and to protect the taxpayers where the money comes from. So you're trying to be cost efficient. You're trying to make sure that the project can proceed, and you're also trying to protect property owners and displaced persons. And it does seem to me to be fairly well balanced in the interests of all of those stakeholders. Nothing's perfect, but I've really loved working with it, and I'm a great boomer for them, for the act and all the ways that it really works well under certain situations. So, okay, so when is a project subject to the URA? So URA requirements are most often triggered by the use of these HUD things. HUD home funds, they trigger the URA, but they also trigger 104D, can. HUD CDBG funds, same thing. And any HUD cap contract that's on a property or will be in the final development will trigger the URA. That can sneak up on some people. You can, a developer or a project can say, you know what, we don't want to take any of this federal money because we don't want to be beholden to any of these rules. And then they look up and they find out that somebody from HUD gives them a call and says, you have a HAP contract. I hope you're following the Uniform Act. So
Lee, I'm going to jump in one more time. Sorry. I don't know who our audience is, so I just want to explain that CDBG stands for Community Development Block Grant Funds, and those are given to state and local governments, and they can sometimes be used for housing projects, since I think that's kind of the audience here. And HAP contracts, when you hear HAP, think Section 8. If you hear that a project has Section 8 in it, that's kind of the equivalent of hearing HAP contract. And sometimes we call them other things, but that's what we're talking about.
Perfect. I do have a lot of alphabet soup in here, and so thank you for clarifying that for us. So any of these funds in any part of the project can trigger the Uniform Act. So just as a rule of thumb, in my experience, HUD Section 104D can trigger more stringent relocation requirements than just the URA, because you have two elements going on there. You have the 104D requirements in addition, which does include payments available under the URA rules. Section 18, demo Dyspo, can be seen to trigger less stringent requirements, but they still are mandatory, and we still have to understand what they are. The lower income housing tax credit, LIHTC programs, they don't automatically trigger the URA by themselves, but oftentimes the developer doing, those kind of programs will involve the use of federal funds or vouchers, either the home funds or the CDBG funds or the Section 8 vouchers, and the use of those in any LIHTC program or project will also trigger the Uniform Act. So that's important to know. Jade, did I cover that? Okay.
Well, unless they're tenant-based vouchers, but any project-based assistance from HUD is probably going to trigger, yes.
Absolutely, right. So that's a really good clarification. So yeah, tenant-based won't, project-based will. Super. I'm glad this is being recorded. I'm going to learn a lot from it too. Okay, why in the world is that important? Well, failure to comply with all applicable federal regulations under the URA and Section 18, 104D, Section 104D can result in a high risk to a project schedule and or budget. It can also result in HUD findings of non-compliance and mandatory corrective action. Again, that can put a roadblock in a project. And in some cases, if you really underestimate the budget and end up in a bad place, it can even cause the bankruptcy of a project or developer. And then the grantee is on the line to come up with that additional funding. So all of these things, there are some consequences, and that's kind of why we decided to put this on. There can be some really negative consequences in not understanding how this all works. This is not an area where you want to ask forgiveness rather than permission.
And to make it real, I would just say that I'm currently working with someone who is dealing with $100,000 worth of unanticipated relocation costs as corrective actions.
Wow. Yeah, and I'm sure this is not the first time you've run into that either, Jade, right?
Just know it can be very expensive, especially if you don't anticipate it. You want to know up front what your relocation obligations are, not on the back end.
Right, that's super. Kind of like having people come to Thanksgiving and you haven't taken the turkey out of the freezer, that's a problem. So that's where planning gets you. Okay, we're going to look at quickly again. This is very dense, so we don't have to go through all of it, but there are these things called voluntary acquisitions, under which you don't have to, you don't have to pay the seller relocation benefits. However, intuitively, you'd think that would just be a willing buyer, willing seller thing. No, no, no. There are specific regulatory requirements under the URA regulations at 49 CFR 24101B1 through 5. Be sure that your acquisition or your that deal is going to fit under all of those. Well, it's going to meet the criteria that are there. If they do meet that criteria, then property owners are not eligible for relocation assistance because they can choose to do the deal or not. Tenants cannot choose to do the deal or not, so they are eligible for relocation assistance. And there are additional relaxed acquisition requirements as far as valuation and no review, and you might be able to offer less than market value. Be very careful that you don't misrepresent or misidentify a voluntary acquisition. That can come back to bite you. A good way to be sure that you document that appropriately is there is a fabulous HUD voluntary acquisition letter as an appendix to HUD Handbook 1378. That's a really good idea to have in your file, and the project owner should probably provide that acquisition letter to the property owner or the seller during negotiations to make sure that it's documented correctly. So anything that does not meet those pretty narrow requirements, we're calling it either an involuntary, non-voluntary, or just another subpart B acquisition. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's under the threat of eminent domain. It can be just anything that doesn't meet that strict narrow definition above must follow all the requirements of the URA. That means it has to have an appraisal, including the opportunity for the owner to join the appraiser on the walkthrough. There needs to be a review appraisal, and the agency does have to offer just compensation. And in this case, both the owners and the tenants do qualify as displaced. So that's a lot of information, but be careful on that one. You got a good guide here for that. What is the timing on all this? This is kind of a good little roadmap. The grantee will first develop the program, then the owner proposes the project. The owner demonstrates capacity and capability to do it. They estimate the cost, and they should have as good a high-level relocation estimate at this point that they can, so they can demonstrate that they know what they're doing and they are estimating accurately and putting enough budget in play. The owner should send a general information notice, a GIN, to tenants early, and we'll talk about that, to tell the tenants that are hearing about a project, hey, there may be a project, there may be the use of federal funds, you may be eligible for benefits, but you're not yet. And so don't get scared, don't move, make sure that you still follow your lease, do all the, be a good tenant and all that stuff, and we'll let you know later. But don't move because of the project yet, because if you move too early, you may not be eligible for the benefits that you would be otherwise if this all goes through. So that's truly important that that goes out. Then the grantee reviews the application. There should be tenant needs and preferences determined in the relocation plan and the identification of any problematic areas and how the project is going to take care of those. A much better determination of relocation costs based on an actual estimate of what's going to happen and not just flipping through the regulations and looking at the dollar figures that shoot out at you. The grantee and the owner will have an agreement, and the tenant notices will be prepared, and then the agreement's signed. And once the agreement is signed, that's when you can send out notices of non-displacement or notices of eligibility. They can be sent to all tenants, and the relocation begins. A hint at this stage is to know who occupies this property. And don't take the seller's word for it, because they may not even know themselves. An appraisal can give a good clue about that. And another really good thing that the HUD audit may need to see, or some of the funding folks may need to see, is an occupancy certification from the seller that goes back 90 days from the purchase officer. And a lot of times that will have a rent roll in it to show who was there, who is there, who left, and why. We'll find out that there are some issues around that oftentimes. And so that's another important piece. Jay, do you have anything here you'd like to?
Well, I would just point out that that occupancy certification is not required, but I always suggest it. The main thing is that you want to be absolutely certain that you know who the recent occupants and the current occupants of that property are, because you want to know who potentially qualifies for relocation assistance. Again, you don't want to be surprised.
Thank you. More hints about this. It's important to note that no resident can be required to move for at least 90 days after they're formally offered relocation eligibility. That can be an issue. I'll talk about that when I get to the red print below. That 90-day period usually begins when the HUD funding agreement is signed, or it could be on the date of the closing of the property. So what you might end up in a very difficult place when you think that you're going to be able to have a vacated building at the closing, even if that's what the contract says. If those tenants have not been provided notices of eligibility and their 90 days notices have not run out, then you're in trouble. You cannot, your construction schedule can be really hit if you're making that kind of assumption. And sometimes what I've seen happen is that, if the eligibility does begin on the closing of the property, if people want to have that property closer to ready for construction at the closing date, sometimes a grantee will take the risk to provide early eligibility to allow that all to happen. So so understand that there's a timing gap there that you may not see that it's there until you get there. And so understand that that can be an issue. Are you good with that? Jay, do you have anything there on that point?
I would just say, no, it's important to know that for residential tenants, that 90-day period, you can't start your 90-day, I'm going to kick them out clock until you issue information on available comparable replacement housing. So it's not just saying you're eligible for benefits, it's you have to actually say, here is an available place for you to move to before you get to start the 90-day clock.
And you probably have to be funded to be able to move forward with that once you provide eligibility. If somebody goes out and finds something, you want to be aware of that part of the calculation too.
Well, you also want to issue the comparable replacement unit because you want to be able to cap your relocation costs. And if you don't provide them information on it, then they really could often go pick their own.
Absolutely. Okay. So HUD and other relocation program specifics. I'm going to kind of go through this maybe a little faster. Who is eligible under the URA? It's a residential occupant, which can be an owner or a tenant, a business occupant, an owner or a tenant, or just somebody that has some personal property on the site, an owner or a tenant, who permanently moves themselves and or their personal property as a direct result of the project. So there's great stuff in the Uniform Act under 24.2 under who is and who is not a displaced person. And it's lovely reading for somebody that's as much of a zealot as I am. So you can get more information just by reading the regulation about that. The residential benefits, we're really not going to go into business benefits today, but the residential benefits are advisory services. The relocation agent provides notices, counseling, explanation of rights and benefits, helps with claims. Also very important, comparable housing through vouchers, which are HCVs, or replacement housing payments. And again, comparable has its own regulatory definition that's under the definitions in 49 CFR 24.2. So it is a legally defined term that is really wise to go in and look and see what that means, because one of the elements of comparable housing is it has to be within the displaced person's financial means. And that's where these payments and or transfers and or vouchers come into to place. And then there are also moving costs that are provided.
I would just say, for anybody who's really unfamiliar with comparable housing, basically we're talking about equal or better to what they had before, and decent, safe, and sanitary, meaning that it meets all local housing and occupancy codes.
Right, and also, Jade, it's also under the public housing area. It could be housing that meets the public housing criteria.
Right, if they're in an assistance program, they also have to live by the restrictions of those programs. But in general, think equal or better to what they had before, and it meets all of the standards for housing.
Perfect, thank you. Miscellaneous, we already talked about, not less than 90 days from the notification of eligibility. And for residences, the offer of the comparable replacement housing is the time period. Aliens, and that's the word that the regulation uses, not lawfully present in the U.S., are not eligible for payments or even advisory assistance unless there's a hardship determination under the URA. Lawful corporations can be found eligible. And FHWA guidance for addressing households with mixed legal status should be referenced if you end up in that situation, excuse me. Relocation payments are not considered income. That does not mean we are tax preparers. If somebody asks us if their benefits are taxable, we refer them to, I refer them to a citation in the CFR, and then tell them to go consult with a tax specialist to be sure that that they're in a good position with the IRS. A person can appeal pretty much anything they don't like about the finding of the agency. They can appeal their eligibility for or amount of a payment. They can appeal housing comparability. So that is a right that they have if they are not satisfied with the assistance they've been provided by the agency. So what about 104D relocation benefits? What's the trigger there? First thing we talked about was home or CDBG funds being used, and housing is either being demolished or lower income housing is being converted to something that's not low income housing, like non-housing, so a community center or an office or a hotel, or it's being converted to housing that actually rents above the HUD fair market rent, which is also something you can find online. Hint, if both of those factors aren't present, you don't have to worry about 104D being triggered. And as far as the benefits are concerned, those relocation benefits under 104D are only applicable to lower income tenants, which is 80%
Area median income.
Oh yeah, AMR, right? But the 104D one-for-one replacement requirements do apply regardless of what the occupancy is. So that's kind of a quick primer on 104D.
As we race through these requirements, I just like remind participants that if you have questions about any of these or a particular issue that this raises for you, feel free to put that in the chat box so that we can try to address it either during the presentation or later.
Thanks. I'm kind of trying to be all things for all people on this presentation, which doesn't always work, but we do have a good resource here, I hope. Something to know about 104D relocation: you take the differential, and the rent supplement covers 60 months under 104D and not 42 months under the URA. It's calculated under a total tenant payment calculation, which is using the resident's adjusted income, and it's not rent to rent or 30%, as we say under the Uniform Act. Down payment assistance is limited to the purchase of a cooperative or mutual housing, and that's not, last time I looked, that's not available in Colorado. I don't think that's changed. Lower income tenants can choose relocation assistance either under the Uniform Act or Section 104D, and that's their choice. They have to be offered benefit packages under each so that they can adequately make that choice for themselves and given counseling around that. Sometimes they can get a voucher under 104D, which could last longer, but sometimes they can get money under URA. So that's an interesting conversation sometimes. Owner occupants are not covered under, but they are still subject to the URA. Businesses are not covered under 104D, but again, they're subject to the URA. And Joan Morgan gave me this a million years ago. She said, who's a former wonderful HUD relocation specialist, illegal aliens are not excluded yet. And so is that still accurate, Jade?
That is where we stand, correct.
Okay. We're getting close to our 50 ways. So HUD Section 18 Demo Dispo, it's different. It does provide a waiver for the relocation for the URA benefits. It's only for PHA Demo Dispo projects. Not only replacement housing payments are actually not allowed under this program, but people are people that are displaced here, they're put into, or they're provided housing in other public housing units. They're given either a project-based Section 8 voucher or a tenant-based Section 8 voucher. And generally, Jade, correct me if I'm wrong here, you want to match kind of like assistance with like assistance. You wouldn't, while if there are no public housing units available, you could provide somebody that's displaced from a public housing unit with a voucher, but you probably wouldn't want to go the other way, or you wouldn't need to go the other way. When people have vouchers, it wouldn't be appropriate to try and put them
it doesn't cover people who have vouchers. It only covers it's basically demolition or disposition of traditional public housing units.
Very good.
I would just say my one warning here, if we have any housing authorities on the line, is that you need to make sure that the actual relocation action is covered by the Demo Dispo project. Sometimes there's something like you could have a choice neighborhoods activity that leads into a Section 18 project. And if the choice neighborhoods portion of that project is causing disposition, then the URA does still apply. So just be careful if you're thinking it's not exempt because of Section 18, that the displacement action is part of the Demo Dispo project itself.
And something else, Jade, I don't want to start a hornet's nest here, but something we've run into before is if you have somebody in a public housing unit that is eligible for that public housing unit, but when you go to try and provide them a voucher, they do not, or even try and put them into another unit, there's something in their history that prohibits them from being included in those programs. And that's something you're going to want to find out about probably and work with HUD to resolve.
Yes, and if you have grandfathered in, there is this small population where if you have grandfathered in persons, they might not actually receive a relocation benefit. They might simply receive referral to market rate housing, but that's a very specific situation. So, and
you'll need to be hand in glove with HUD about that if that happens. Okay. Temporary relocation, it is contained in the Appendix A of the URA regs, and it is to protect people that do not have the protections under the regular part of the URA, people that are displaced but only temporarily and not permanently. So they do get benefits, but those benefits are different than those found in the body of the CFR for permanently displaced people. So temporary relocation is usually caused by rehabilitation. The grantee or the project owner has to pay all out of pocket, reasonable and necessary out of pocket expenses for housing and moving both out and back. Anything that they are being moved into temporarily has to be decent, safe, and sanitary. And per diem needs to be paid if the temporary unit does not have a kitchen. Also, if the temporary relocation lasts over 1 year, the project must offer the permanent relocation benefits to those displacees under the Uniform Act. They don't necessarily have to take it, but you have to offer it to them.
And I'd say one thing to note on temporary relocation is that if you're temporarily relocating someone, you have to offer decent, safe, and sanitary temporary housing, but it only needs to be suitable for the household and the time frame they're being displaced. It doesn't have to meet the comparability standard of the URA.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. That's important. All right, here we are. We're at the 50 ways finally. I think I have 5 minutes, but maybe we take just a smidge more. This is what you guys, apologies to Jade. I was looking at for a letter of non-compliance. This is not under the program we're talking about, but this is a letter. We do not want to get a letter with this subject ever. So this is hopefully how to avoid that. All right, here we go. Number 1, be aware that the seller cannot vacate the building by attrition, lease termination, or eviction before the sale. That's an end run around the relocation benefits, and it's a problem.
Or after the sale either.
Pardon?
Or after the sale.
Or after the sale.
I've also had projects think that relocation through attrition would help them meet their program goals, and it doesn't really work.
No, and it's one of those intuitive things. It's my property. Why can't I do what I want to? It's because you can, but then you don't get federal money. We can always do what we want to do, but that can limit our choices later. 2, we talked about making sure our voluntary acquisition meets the requirements of 24-101 if you plan not to pay the owner benefits, but you must also still pay the tenants. Number 3, account for any federal assistance like existing vouchers or the use of any federal funds in a project before deciding the URA doesn't apply. Like I said, some people will say we don't want any of that silly federal money because we don't want to follow the rules, only to find out that they didn't recognize there was something hidden in the final project entity that triggered the rules after all. So be careful about that.
Sorry, Lee, I think on there, it's also a good place to point out, just a reminder that the federal funding at any stage triggers the URA. So you can't just say, oh, well, we'll wait and apply for home after everything else is done, because it still applies if federal funds go in at any stage of the project. So just know about that.
Excellent. Document timely delivery of all required notices. Do not slip a notice under somebody's door. Don't post it in the hall. Don't give it to somebody in the parking lot without getting a signed receipt. This happens a lot. Did you give somebody, I'll have a meeting and I'll say, did you give them gins? Well, sure, we put them on the door. That's fine, but it doesn't count. Has to be documented. So be careful about document.
Lee, if I may add to that, now that we're in our COVID stages and everybody's kind of limiting and social distancing, what we found is email delivery has worked for us. So that's something else to add to that portion. If you're unable to physically meet with them or mail it, you can definitely email it with a confirmed receipt.
And will that work for you, Jade?
I think there might still be a legal issue on that. I don't know for sure what the answer is. I know that regulatorily there are 2 options. You can serve it in person, or you can send it certified mail with a return receipt requested. I know that the email question came up as part of the notice of proposed rulemaking, and I can't tell you for certain that that is 100% appropriate. I can only tell you what the regulation says.
And what I might suggest there, I think Magley's got a good point, so that we know the people that are sending the notices, go ahead and do it via email and email receipt, and follow it up with a certified copy. And if the person does not pick up that certified copy, all you need to do is put that in your file. You don't have to document that they you know, a lot of the stuff that we do, we have to document that we took the action required. We don't have to document, I mean, we can't force them to pick up a letter or do anything like that. So
doing both of those sounds perfect.
so we want to do both things so that we have it covered on we know that they got it, and they know that they got it, but we also have something for the file that meets the paper regulatory requirements. 5, do not use statutory maximum payment amounts or the current number of bedrooms in each dwelling that you're going to be having to replace to build your relocation budget. I can't tell you the number of times I've gone to an agency and they said, well, it says right here it's only $7,200 per tenant, so that's what we used. That's not correct. That's not what you're going to find. Also, we're going to find out that in certain circumstances, some people are overhoused or underhoused. I'm sorry. You'll have way too many people in a unit, and you're going to have to provide under comparable housing a bigger unit, which is going to be more money. So the relocation budget that's developed needs to be thoughtfully and adequately and accurately prepared with facts and with somebody that has experience. You just really can't glean what you need from reading. You need some experience when you're doing that to be sure your budget is adequate.
And to say that another way for people who might have a little bit less experience, yes, the regulation says the maximum payment for a displaced residential person is $7,200. But what you need to know is there's also a category called last resort housing that you fall into if it takes more than that amount of money to get them into comparable replacement housing. So that's what Lee is talking about.
Right, and we've got another 50-way that goes into that a little later on that explains it a little better. Understand that an occupant does not need a lease to be eligible for relocation benefits. So they say, well, that's okay. They're not eligible. They don't have a lease. That's not a requirement. Okay. So,
or people often talk about month-to-month leases and they think that gets them out of relocation. Same thing. Failure to renew a lease is displacement.
Yes. Make sure tenants 7 who will not be displaced are provided with written notices of non-displacement. Again, you're protecting the agency and you're protecting them. They can, you know, find out that a friend of theirs got a lot of money and come back and say, well, I didn't ever get a notice, and why didn't you give me money? So, and I'm sure there are other, you know, there are other reasons, but these things that are requirements are really, they're like our parents told us, they're for our own good. Many times they're to keep things orderly
and specifically under the CDBG and home programs, if you do not provide a written notice of non-displacement or the equivalent, and someone moves out for their personal reasons, they will qualify as displaced.
Very important. Understanding that general information notices must be provided early to keep potentially eligible tenants from moving before they're eligible, because people talk, and if they don't have information, they'll think somebody's going to come and kick them out, because that's what happens sometimes. That's why those general information notices are so important. And again, those have to be sent. They have to be sent the way that we talked about earlier. You need to document that you sent them and that they went out. And then again, it's for everybody's benefit.
And if you're the agency, that GIN only protects you. It does nothing for the tenant other than possibly make them ineligible for benefits. So make sure you send GINs.
Absolutely. 9, don't expect a vacant property at closing if the notices of eligibility and comparable housing have not been given and the 90-day notices have not expired. We've talked about that. 10, remember, a temporarily displaced person must be offered permanent assistance after 12 months. We talked about that. 11, be aware that a move-in notice can only be given to a new tenant after the application for funding has been submitted. So if you have a vacant unit and the project is up and going and you want to fill it temporarily, you don't have to give that tenant benefits. You could say you're coming in. You can give a move-in notice that says you're coming in with the understanding that you're going to have to move, and so that's our agreement. It's not a surprise, but a seller or a project cannot just go ahead and give everybody a move-in notice years before the project to save themselves from providing benefits. That timing on that notice has to be after the application for funding has been submitted. Is that right, Jay?
Correct. That's by definition. That's the definition of a move-in notice, HUD's definition.
Yeah. Perfect. Remember, the rules still apply even if the owner approaches the agency and developer wanting to sell. Well, I want to sell. Well, good. But that means, it doesn't mean that we're automatically in a voluntary acquisition. 13, be sure to find out if there are additional tenants or in-home businesses that will also require relocation, especially in single-family home situations. That could affect your budget and your timing. If a tenant is evicted for cause, be sure you can document that the eviction was not undertaken because of the project. It has to be under state law. It has to be for continued or significant violations of the lease. And it can't even be because the tenant refuses to cooperate with the process. That's not going to fly either. So be careful about evictions.
Well, so just to clarify there, you might have to evict people if at the end of 90 days you've done your due diligence and they're still dragging their feet. But the only difference is the recognition that they still qualify for relocation benefits. They can drag their feet. You can evict them at the end of the 90 days and they still get benefits.
That's a great clarification. Thank you, Jade. 15, if you allow an owner occupant to rent back after closing, know that you may be creating a tenant eligible for benefits. So this is under the no good deed goes unpunished thing. You've got an owner occupant, it's an arm's length, no problem, no harm, no foul. And they say, can we stay a year because you're not going to do the project? You say yes, then they turn into a tenant, and HUD can find that you have created a tenant that's eligible for benefits from an owner that wasn't, by virtue of allowing them to stay in the tenant role. So that's a surprise to some people. So be aware. Always send a GIN to every tenant as soon as possible. Otherwise, you might have to hunt down former tenants and pay them benefits. I've been there before. So that's what happens when Jade says it's protecting the agency and not necessarily the tenant. 17, be clear that the project's relocation budget does not dictate the level of eligible relocation benefits. It's the other way around. A developer should not say, I have this much money to spend on relocation, so we'll just divide it up and whatever goes, goes. That is not going to serve any project well. The budget needs to be developed based on the rules and the requirements, not on just how much money is in hand. I've seen that happen. So be ready to exceed the statutory maximum amounts under 401 and 402, like we were talking about, that $7,200, because as Jade said, comparable housing is often only available under the rules of housing of last resort, which means it takes what it takes. And so, that's the other clarification that she was giving.
Lee,
yeah.
Before you send out this slide deck to everybody, maybe you could change that to housing of last resort, just because not everybody might be familiar with HLR.
I will do that. Okay. 19, find out early if displaced tenants can meet transfer move back requirements. Over income tenants may need market-based relocation payments, or they may need other vouchers. Sometimes your LIHTC program income limits are below even your voucher limits. So, it's good to know which tenants will be able to qualify to move back in or transfer to another property and which won't. That's another good thing you're planning.
It's very typical for LIHTC projects to displace at least one tenant because they're over income, even if it was a formerly assisted project. Yeah, so be aware that that's out there and don't make any assumptions. Understand the difference between the total tenant payments, which is how you calculate a relocation payment under 104D, and the 30% rule under the Relocation Act. They're not the same. So do your homework, and there are a lot of interesting little wiggles and waggles in that to look at. So it's good to do sort of a comparison matrix about what those benefits would be under each of those circumstances. We're last time here, guys. Sorry, we're not leaving a lot of time for questions, but understand that taking on a mobile home park is almost always very difficult, very complicated, and very expensive. Do I hear an amen on that one? Yep.
Maybe not. Be aware that the occupant of a temporary dwelling, such as a tiny home for the homeless, might be considered a displaced person, because under the definition of displaced person, it's not just a permanent, a dwelling's not just a permanent place of residence, but it can be a permanent or, oh my heavens, the words have escaped me, traditional or customary place of residency. So if you get into a weird situation, get with your HUD folks and make sure that your assumptions are correct, because they may not be. Remember that we haven't talked much about RAD, but RAD does prohibit involuntary permanent relocations. But incentives like vouchers and sometimes even monetary payments can be used to promote voluntary relocation to make sure that you have the LIHTC units open that you hope that you do. All right, last thing. HUD will audit your project, at least for this list. Keep a clean, complete file for every relocatee, document, and you'll be happy you did. And that's our 24, 25 to 50. I would love to hear from you guys. I'd love to get an email or something that we can put in. So if there's anything that we did not cover, and there's a ton of them, we wouldn't have had, we have barely enough time to hit the ones we did. We'd love to hear from you. And now we can open it up to some discussion and questions in the brief few minutes we have left. I'm sorry it was so jam-packed, but let's see if anybody has anything they'd like to talk about.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Jade. Thank you, Magali. So as she said, we've got still a few minutes left for questions. If anyone wants to pop those in the chat, I'll just give you a few minutes to do that while I just do a few more housekeeping things. Just to remind you, thank you, Lee and Magali and Jade, for joining us today and putting on this webinar. Lee's contact information is there. You can find Jade's contact information at the HUD Relocation website if you want to reach out to her, as well as, of course, you can reach out to us at Housing Colorado if you have any questions that you'd like us to pass along. This slide presentation, as well as a link to the recorded webinar, is going to be on our website, and we will send a link out to all of the folks who have registered for today's presentation.
Just because I haven't seen anything pop up in the chat, I would like to say that HUD is intending to, like, we have a training, a web-based training out there called URA the HUD Way. You can actually just Google URA the HUD Way and it will come up. And we're in the process of developing a series of modules under that training, where a Section 104D training is imminent, and we will also be coming out with a non-residential module and a residential module, and hopefully someday a planning module and a compliance module.
I really want to thank Jade for taking her lunch hour, her precious time to give us so much good information with this, and I'd like to thank Magali Fernandez from my office for helping me develop this this presentation. I'd like to thank Housing Colorado for giving us the opportunity to have fun and kind of get all this information. I learned a lot, put everything together, and I hope you all did too. And feel free to contact me if you have any questions that aren't better asked to Jade.
Great, thanks everybody. And I'm also just going to post one more. I did post that link to URA the HUD Way in the chat, and I'm going to go ahead and repost the links to our event, the Housing Colorado event page, as well as our Housing Colorado conference page. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording right now.
Phil,
you absolutely can. Yes, go for it.
Sorry, one of the coolest things, community planning and development, Jade, there is a HUD audit template for your files that HUD auditors use, and it asks all these questions, and when have you done this and that? The coolest thing, it's like finding the mimeograph test sheet in the garbage for those of us that are old enough to remember test sheets. If you can go in there and Google that and use that as your file template, so that if you could answer all the questions that HUD's going to ask during their audit, before HUD audits, you're going to be in great shape. And that can be found under the I'll send that to Philip and we'll put that in the slide deck. It's just a great HUD asset resource for making sure your files are in tip-top condition for a HUD audit.
Great, thanks, Lee. That sounds super useful.
And
Jade,
Philip,
Lee, anything to add? Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Is there any feedback that's going to happen for these sessions? Because if so, I'd love to get that.
I'm not sure whether we'll be sending out a survey. I need to talk to our team. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't, depending on what's going on. But if we do, if I receive any feedback and if we do send out a survey, I'll be sure to share that with you, of course.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.